Cruise ships have a certain mythology to them. People treat them as floating playgrounds, insulated from danger, tucked away from the messy realities of the world. Boundless buffets, unlimited drinks, lounge chairs lining sun-washed decks, steel railings shimmering above the endless blue. But behind that glossy surface lies something darker, something people rarely talk about until tragedy drags it into the light. And on one warm Caribbean morning in the late 1990s, that darkness swallowed a young woman named Amy Lynn Bradley without leaving a single piece of her behind. Welcome back to Dark Case Desk. If this is your first time here, hi, hello, welcome. I'm really glad you made it today because what we're about to walk into is a maze of unanswered questions, unsettling eyewitness accounts, suspicious behavior, and a trail of evidence that seems to slip like water through cupped hands. Before we get into the heart of this story, please take a second to like this video, drop a comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps keep cases like this alive, and it tells the algorithm that these stories deserve to be seen. The case of Amy Lynn Bradley has fascinated and haunted the public for more than 20 years. Her disappearance in the year 1998 is the kind of story that lingers in your mind long after you hear it. Not because it's unsolved, many cases are unsolved, but because of how it happened, where it happened, and everything that was allowed to go wrong in the hours and days that followed. Recently, a new documentary has brought fresh attention to the case. But for every detail that documentary included, there were others left out, others buried, others glossed over. Today, we are going to walk through the full picture, every angle, every sighting, every inconsistency, every dark possibility. Let's begin where all stories should begin, with the life, not the disappearance. Amy Lynn Bradley was born on May 12, 1974, in Petersburg, Virginia. She grew up in Chesterfield County, wrapped in the warmth of a tight, devoted family. She was the oldest child of Ron and Iva Bradley, and she had one sibling, her younger brother, Brad, who was 2 years younger. The siblings were inseparable, the kind who had inside jokes no one else understood, the kind who shared secrets late at night in whispered voices, the kind who were more like best friends than anything else. If you were to ask anyone who knew Amy to describe her, you'd hear the same descriptions over and over. She was outgoing, she was athletic, she was confident and bright and fun. She had a smile that carved itself into people's memories. She loved being around others, loved music, loved dancing, loved the feeling of possibility that fills your 20s like an open horizon. Basketball was her passion, and she was good, very good. Good enough to earn a full college scholarship. She graduated with a degree in physical education and was preparing to start a new job at a computer consulting firm immediately after returning from the cruise. Everything in her life was lining up. She had just moved into her first apartment, a milestone moment for anyone in their early 20s, and she had plans to adopt a bulldog puppy she intended to name Bailey. She had already arranged to pick Bailey up when she got back. Ask anyone who remembers that time in their own life, and they'll tell you your new apartment feels like freedom. It feels like adulthood cracking open. It feels like you are stepping into the future with the whole world ahead of you. That is where Amy stood. On the edge of something new and bright and promising. The cruise itself was never her idea. It wasn't even something she had always dreamed of. The vacation was a reward that her father, Ron, earned through his work as an insurance executive. A company incentive for top performers, a week-long Caribbean cruise aboard the Rhapsody of the Seas, operated by Royal Caribbean. At first, Amy didn't want to go. Something about the ocean unsettled her. She wasn't afraid of water, but she didn't like the idea of being surrounded by endless miles of it with no land in sight, nothing but the hum of engines and the roll of waves. Her parents reassured her. They told her it would be fun, that they would all be together, that she had nothing to worry about. Eventually, she agreed. On March 21, 1998, the Bradley family flew to San Juan, Puerto Rico, and boarded the Rhapsody of the Seas, along with more than 2,000 passengers. The itinerary included Aruba, Curacao, St. Martin, and St. Thomas, 4 beautiful destinations, each offering its own postcard moments. Passengers settled into the ship's rhythm, exploring lounges, pools, dining rooms, bars, and entertainment venues. For the first 2 days, everything appeared normal. The Bradley family spent time together, took photos, ate meals, and explored the ship. Amy continued to be cautious near the railings, something her parents and brother remembered very clearly. She did not like the edges. She did not lean over them. She kept a safe distance, sometimes looking to her family for reassurance when the railing felt too close to the drop into the dark water below. This is a detail that matters later, more than most people realize. On the night of Monday, March 23, 1998, the ship had left Aruba and was sailing overnight toward Curaçao, with plans to dock early the next morning. That evening, the ship threw a Mardi Gras-themed party at one of its late-night venues, a club-style bar that stayed open around the clock. Patrons drank, danced, and celebrated the carefree joy of vacation. Amy and her brother Brad went to the party together. There are photographs and video clips from that night released years later by investigators that show Amy dancing, smiling, talking to fellow passengers. She seemed happy, fully present, enjoying herself. But among those photos is a person who would later become central to the case. His stage name was Yellow. His real name was Alistair Douglas, a bass player from Grenada who performed nightly with the ship's band, Blue Orchid. Witnesses from that night recalled that Yellow showed particular interest in Amy. They danced closely. They talked. At one point, his behavior made Amy uncomfortable enough that she told him to back off. But after that moment, the energy remained light. She kept dancing with other passengers, kept smiling, kept enjoying her night. Yellow later claimed he left the club around 1 in the morning because crew members were required to return to their quarters at a certain hour. According to him, that was the last time he saw Amy. But multiple independent witnesses later contradicted that claim. Their stories would become some of the most important in the entire case. Around 3:30 in the morning, Amy and Brad decided to head back to their family's cabin. The electronic room key logs show Brad entered the suite at approximately 3:35. Amy followed a few minutes later. Their parents were asleep. The cabin opened onto a private balcony, and Amy and Brad stepped outside to unwind, talk, and breathe the cool night air before turning in. Amy mentioned feeling slightly seasick and told Brad she might stay on the balcony for a little while. They hugged. Brad told her he loved her, something he later said he will forever be grateful for. He went to bed. Amy stayed behind. About 2 hours later, at around 5:30 in the morning, Amy's father stirred awake. He glanced outside and saw what he believed were Amy's legs stretched on a lounge chair. He also remembered the balcony door being closed. Feeling comforted by the sight, he drifted back to sleep. Around 6:30 in the morning, everything changed. Ron woke up suddenly, with a powerful sense that something was off. He looked toward the balcony. The door, which had been closed earlier, was now open about a foot. The lounge chair was empty. He checked the cabin. Amy was not there. Her shoes were still inside the room. Her ID was there. Her room key was there. Her purse was there. She had not taken anything except, possibly, her cigarettes and lighter. That was it. Ron immediately began searching the ship. He looked on the upper decks, the jogging track, the cafes, anywhere Amy might go to watch the sunrise or take photographs. Nothing, no sign, no trace. No Amy. By 7 o'clock, the Rhapsody of the Seas was docking in Willemstad, Curaçao. Passengers were getting ready to disembark for the day. Ron rushed back to the cabin, woke Iva, and told her their daughter was missing. What happened next is one of the most criticized decisions in the history of the case. When the Bradleys begged crew members to make an announcement and stop passengers from leaving the ship, they were told no. They were told it was too early to disturb passengers. They were told they could not delay the planned disembarkation. They were told the ship had a schedule to maintain. So while the Bradleys were pleading for help, the ship lowered its gangway exactly as planned. Hundreds of passengers spilled into Curaçao, walking off the ship at the exact moment the family believed their daughter might be somewhere on board or being taken off by someone else. There was no immediate lockdown, no urgent search, no announcement telling passengers to look for a missing woman, no request for anyone to check cabins, stairwells, or halls. Time was slipping away. When the first announcement finally came, around 7:50 in the morning, Miss Amy Bradley, please report to the purser's desk. 90% of the passengers had already disembarked. Iva stood on deck watching crowds pour out, knowing Amy was not among them. When the captain finally told the family that a full vessel Charlie drill would be conducted, the Bradleys felt a flicker of hope. But by late afternoon, they were told that the search had revealed no sign of Amy and that the ship would proceed to its next scheduled port, St. Martin. The Bradleys refused to leave the island. They got off the ship and stayed in Curaçao, searching frantically, speaking to locals, passing out flyers, talking to anyone who might have seen something. Meanwhile, the Rhapsody of the Seas sailed away, potentially carrying key witnesses, or even suspects, with it. For the next several days, the family launched their own search on Curaçao. They worked with local police. They searched the beaches. They spoke to taxi drivers, shop owners, fishermen, anyone. They were desperate. They were terrified. They were fighting against the clock in a place they did not know. Meanwhile, the U.S. Coast Guard searched the waters along the ship's route for 4 days. They found nothing. No clothing. No body. No debris. And local experts familiar with the currents said that if a person had gone overboard at that place and time close to shore with specific tidal patterns, something would almost certainly surface. When the FBI finally boarded the Rhapsody of the Seas on March 26 in St. Thomas, days had already passed. They searched, interviewed, examined, questioned, and documented everything they could. But by then, the ship was no longer a pristine crime scene. Thousands of passengers had moved across the deck since Amy had vanished. Evidence, if it had existed, was gone. The Bradleys eventually returned home. But Ron and Brad later returned to Curacao for a second search, and this time they encountered some of the first eyewitness accounts that suggested Amy may have been seen alive after leaving the ship. A taxi driver told them he recognized Amy from their flyers. He said a young woman matching her description had approached his cab shortly after the ship docked that morning, asking frantically for the nearest phone. He pointed her toward a direction. She ran the opposite way. A chill went through Ron and Brad. If the story was true, Amy had gotten off the ship alive. And the person responsible for taking her may have slipped away among the passengers pouring onto the pier. That was not the only unsettling moment. While driving around Curacao with local authorities, Brad heard someone shout his name, Brad, from a moving vehicle. He said the voice was unmistakable. Amy's voice. The voice he'd heard his whole life. The police stopped the van. Inside was only a driver. No Amy. No one who could explain that voice. Moments like that don't fade. They burn themselves into memory, becoming part of the fabric of a family's grief. Back in the United States, Amy's case gained media attention. It appeared on Unsolved Mysteries. And with that exposure came something else. New tips, new memories, new sightings. And then came the first whispers that what happened to Amy might not have been an accident. It might have been an abduction, a trafficking situation, a coordinated effort, not a fall, not a jump, something planned, something deliberate, something far worse than anyone suspected in those first frantic hours aboard the Rhapsody of the Seas. The idea that Amy had somehow wandered off the ship unnoticed became harder and harder to believe as the hours unfolded. The idea that she had fallen became even more improbable. There was no sign of struggle on the balcony. No sound had woken her family. No splash was heard. And the moment multiple people came forward claiming to have seen her alive later that morning, seen her off the ship, on the island, that possibility began to unravel completely. But while Amy's family was desperately searching for answers on Curacao, pieces of another, darker picture were already forming quietly in the background. A picture no one wants to imagine for their daughter. A picture far more sinister than the idea of a simple accident. It began with behavior on the ship that did not make sense. Conversations that raised alarms. Interactions that now seemed far more significant than they did in the moment. There had been the waiter, the one who approached Amy and her family the night before she vanished, the one who invited her to meet him alone in Aruba, in a bar known for drinking, dancing, and late-night chaos. At the time, they brushed it off as harmless, maybe a little creepy. But in hindsight, the detail became sharp and alarming. Why would a crew member single out a young woman, invite her alone, and do so in front of her family without any hesitation? Why would he later, when questioned by authorities, tell a story that the Bradleys insist never happened? Why point the investigators toward the parents by saying they had asked him hypothetical questions about falling overboard? Why plant that thought, that seed? Then there was Yellow, the bass player from the band Blue Orchid. His inconsistencies would later loom even larger over the case. In his official statement, he said he last saw Amy at 1 in the morning. But witness after witness contradicted that claim. 2 young women who did not know each other, did not speak to each other, and had no connection to the Bradley family reported seeing Amy with him around sunrise, hours after he said he had left her. Their descriptions were vivid. They remembered the elevator rising toward the upper deck. They remembered the expressions, the clothing, the camera in Amy's hand. They remembered Yellow beside her, close, familiar, as if they knew one another. It was too specific, too cleanly aligned to be a coincidence. A third witness, a college student named Crystal, reported seeing them on the upper deck around 5:35 in the morning. She saw Amy holding what looked like a coffee cup. She saw Yellow next to her. 10 minutes later, she saw him walking alone. And it wasn't just that she saw them, it was how she described the moment. She remembered seeing Amy photographing the sunrise as the ship approached the harbor canal into Willemstad. She remembered seeing her camera strap. She remembered the way Amy held her drink. These were not vague, fuzzy memories. These were the kind of details that only come from paying attention. The FBI later spoke with these witnesses. Their accounts were consistent, their memories were clear, and their timelines were impossible to reconcile with Yellow's. Bradley family members later said that Yellow approached Brad early that morning, long before the ship made any announcement, and said, "I'm sorry about your sister." Brad remembered freezing in that moment, thinking, how does he even know she's missing? It was a moment that stuck to him like a burr, one of those interactions that rattles something deep inside you. He knew that only he, his parents, and ship security were aware of the situation. So how, exactly, did a bass player from the ship's band know? There was more. One of the witnesses who saw Amy and Yellow said she saw him hand Amy a drink, a dark liquid in a cup. She did not know what was in it. She had no way of knowing. But she remembered the moment, remembered how uneasy it made her feel, remembered the way she couldn't shake that detail later when she saw Amy's case being discussed in the media. And then there was the matter of the photos that vanished. Cruise ships make money by photographing passengers and selling the prints. Every night, photographers roam the ship capturing portraits. Those prints are displayed in a gallery area where people can walk up, find their photos, and purchase them. On the night before Amy vanished, she and her mother went to check for theirs. They found none. The photographer remembered taking pictures of Amy. He remembered printing them. He walked with the family to the display wall where they should have been. They were gone, not misfiled, not moved, gone. No one in the Bradley family took them. No one had purchased them. Someone else had removed them. But why? What possible reason would someone have to secretly remove every printed photograph of a passenger? Unless those images were intended to be used elsewhere. Unless they were intended to be shown to someone else. Unless they were meant to be circulated, not as souvenirs, but as samples. There are cases where traffickers specifically target women on cruise ships. They observe them. They watch their routines. They follow them. They assess their vulnerabilities. They coordinate with others. They strategize. They recruit or abduct in ports where security is looser, or they lure them into areas with fewer witnesses. And, in some of those cases, photographs were used, images of the victims circulated in advance to buyers, using cruise ships as a method of transport and opportunity. It sounds like the plot of a crime thriller. But for Amy's family, the evidence began to fit too cleanly. The pieces lined up in ways that were no longer easy to ignore or dismiss. More sightings began trickling in, each one eerier than the last. The Canadian man from Alberta, who was vacationing in Curacao that August, saw a woman walking on the beach between two men. He later said he never forgot her eyes. He said they were pleading, terrified, filled with a silent kind of desperation that made him stop in his tracks. She briefly broke ahead, as if she was about to speak to him. One of the men barked at her, then leaned in, steering her away. The moment burned itself into his memory, because something in him recognized danger. He later saw Amy's story on television and immediately contacted authorities because he was certain, 100% certain, that the woman he saw was Amy. And there was a reason his sighting carried weight. He accurately described several of Amy's tattoos. Tattoos most people would never know. Tattoos that were unique to her body. Tattoos that only someone who truly saw her could describe. There was the Tasmanian devil spinning a basketball on her shoulder blade, the gecko wrapping around her navel, the Japanese character on her ankle. These weren't random guesses. These were correct, detailed descriptions. Another sighting came from Barbados. In the year 2005, a woman named Judy reported an encounter that would haunt her for years. She had gone into a restaurant restroom. While in the stall, she heard men in the women's restroom, agitated voices, low, controlled, discussing something that made her freeze. They were talking to a woman. They were telling her about a meeting she needed to be prepared for later that night, that she needed to be ready, that someone was expecting her. When the men left, Judy stepped out and saw a woman at the sink. A young woman with an American accent, a woman who looked frightened, a woman who looked defeated. She asked her if she was on vacation. The woman said no. She asked her name. The woman quietly said, "Amy." Judy tried to keep her talking, sensing that something was very wrong. She tried to soothe her by saying she was from the southern United States and had a daughter her age. But something shifted in the woman's expression. A flicker of panic, a darting of the eyes, as if she sensed someone listening. Judy backed off. She left the restroom. The men who had been inside were standing right outside. She squeezed past them, heart pounding, and found her husband. She wanted to call the police. Her husband told her they didn't know enough, that it could be dangerous, that maybe she had misunderstood. She went home. She tried to forget, until she saw Amy's face on television. For 2 years, she had carried that moment in her memory. And in an instant, she was transported back to that restroom. The pleading eyes, the soft southern accent, the whispered name. She contacted authorities immediately. And then came the photograph. The one published on a website advertising adult vacations. The one of a woman with heavy makeup, long hair, and a hardened expression who went by the name Jazz. The one that looked chillingly, unmistakably like Amy. The one that made her parents physically ill when they saw it. The one the FBI's forensic examiner reportedly said was a perfect match. Everything in that photograph, the bone structure, the eyes, the nose, the jawline, the spacing of the features aligned with uncanny precision. Her family believed it was her. The expert believed it was her. Many people online believed it was her. Even those who said it might not be her were forced to grapple with a terrifying question. If it wasn't Amy, then who was this woman? And why had no one ever come forward to identify herself? Then came the revelation that made everything darker, that the website the photograph appeared on was possibly linked to a ring run by an American couple living in Florida. A couple later convicted of promoting prostitution and facilitating sex tourism in the Dominican Republic. Their company operated under multiple names. They changed websites regularly, they shifted domains, but certain things stayed the same. The contact numbers, the names behind the business, the testimonials describing the lineups of women, the descriptions of handlers controlling the women, the references to a man known as Paco who was responsible for managing the women, the outlines of a network that connected American tourists with Caribbean sex tourism. Some of those same phone numbers reportedly appeared on the site where the photograph of Jazz had been posted. This wasn't a conspiracy theory. These were real businesses, real arrests, real indictments, real court files, real women. And possibly, tragically, one of them was Amy. There was also the case of the man who conned Amy's family, Frank Jones. He approached the Bradleys pretending to be a former Special Forces operative. He claimed he had connections within the Caribbean underworld. He said he knew where Amy was being held. He said he had people watching the location. He sent them doctored photographs of a woman they believed might be her. Over time, he took more than $200,000 from the family. When the truth came out that he was a fraud, that he had lied about all of it, that the photographs were fake, he was arrested and later imprisoned for wire fraud. But the damage to the Bradleys ran far deeper than financial. He shattered hope. He weaponized their grief. He preyed on their desperation to bring their daughter home. And yet, even after all of that deception, legitimate sightings continued. They continued in Curacao. They continued in Barbados. They continued in other islands. They continued in whispers, in passing comments, in the haunted memories of travelers who believed they had seen something but did not speak up quickly enough. Amy's family has always said that the biggest tragedy in these delayed reports is that time is the enemy. Every hour matters. Every sighting loses power the longer it sits in silence. Because traffickers move people. They move them between islands. They move them between countries. They change their appearance. They change their location. They change the schedule. And the trail grows cold before authorities even know there was one to follow. But there is one detail that remains one of the most compelling, one of the most fragile, one of the most heartbreaking pieces of this case. Something that emerged only because of a Canadian engineer who had taken interest in the case and began monitoring digital traffic to the Bradley family's website. He noticed over and over again that an IP address originating in Curacao and occasionally in Barbados would visit the website on specific dates. Amy's birthday, her parents' birthdays, the anniversary of her disappearance, certain holidays, and whoever it was stayed on the website for long periods of time, reading, looking, scrolling. The FBI could not act on it. The IP addresses were outside U.S. jurisdiction, and internet service providers do not retain logs for more than about 3 months unless legally required to do so. But the implication lingered. Was it a trafficker? Was it someone involved? Or was it Amy? Was she using the only window she had left to look at her family through a screen? No one knows. No one may ever know. And yet, that detail is one of the reasons her case refuses to die, refuses to fade, refuses to settle into the cold files where so many others have gone. Amy's story is unique in so many ways, but one of the most devastating is how preventable the early missteps were. How easily things could have been different if the crew had taken her family seriously. If disembarkation had been delayed even 15 minutes, if a real search had been conducted immediately, If a lockdown had been ordered, if the cruise line had followed the strictest possible protocol instead of worrying about schedules, itineraries, passenger comfort, and public image. When Ron and Iva filed lawsuits against Royal Caribbean, they were dismissed. The company insisted that they had cooperated fully and did everything they could. They claimed they were sympathetic to the family. But sympathy, without action, is empty. And now, more than 20 years later, the Bradleys continue to live with the weight of all the unanswered questions. They continue to search. They continue to speak out. They continue to follow leads, even when many turn out to be dead ends. They cling to hope because, without it, there is nothing left. This is where Part 2 ends. Part 3 will dive deeper into the trafficking network, the eyewitness contradictions, the failures of the investigative process, the forensic complexities, and the darkest possibilities of what may have happened to Amy after she disappeared. The story of Amy Lynn Bradley's disappearance continued to grow heavier with every passing day, as if each new detail layered itself on top of the last, until the weight of the truth became almost impossible to carry. The early missteps were no longer just mistakes, they were turning points. Moments that, if handled differently, could have shifted the entire trajectory of the case. If the cruise line had locked down the ship immediately, everyone would have still been on board. If the staff had agreed to make an announcement right away, Amy herself might have heard it. If disembarkation had been paused for even 10 or 15 minutes, the person or people responsible might never have left. That window of time, small as it was, became the chasm that swallowed every opportunity to stop what happened next. In the hours after Amy vanished, her family lived in a surreal state, part disbelief, part terror, part instinctive determination that only parents can understand. They walked through the ship searching hallways, jogging tracks, lounges. They peered into cafes, checked stairwells, scanned every face. They watched passengers pour off into Curaçao knowing, with a nauseating pit in their stomachs, that among those hundreds of people could be someone who had taken Amy. Someone who might have led her off the ship quietly, subtly, in a way no one noticed. Someone who might have had help. And beneath the panic was a truth they were slowly beginning to accept. Something far more sinister than an accident had happened. When the FBI finally boarded the ship days later, they faced a vessel that was no longer a clean crime scene. Thousands of footprints had crossed the decks, the corridors, the lounges. Rooms had been cleaned, laundry turned over, trash disposed of. People had slept in beds, showered in bathrooms, touched railings, moved chairs. If anything had happened to Amy on that ship, nearly every trace of it had been erased by routine operations long before investigators stepped foot on board. And yet, witnesses, strangers who had no connection to one another, described seeing Amy alive after her father last saw her on the balcony. These statements divided the timeline into two distinct realities. The one where Amy never left the ship, and the one where she did. And the more those accounts were examined, the clearer it became which version held weight. The elevator sighting by the two young women was particularly significant. They had been on the ship as college students, excited for their cruise, taking photographs, exploring. Their report did not come weeks or months later, it came quickly, while memories were fresh. They remembered seeing the tall, athletic young woman with her dark hair and distinctive posture. They remembered Yellow standing beside her. They even remembered the expression on Amy's face, focused, calm, not distressed, not stumbling or confused. She looked like someone who was awake, alert, maybe even occupied with capturing the sunrise on her camera. It was a moment so ordinary that the only reason they remembered it at all was because they later saw Amy's missing posters. Their statements would later be corroborated independently by Crystal, the college student who also saw Amy in Yellow on the upper deck. Her account described a brief but vivid moment. She had walked up to the deck expecting a quiet sunrise, but instead she noticed a woman standing near the railing with a camera strap over her shoulder. She remembered the way Amy held her coffee cup, the outline of her silhouette against the morning light, the man beside her Yellow standing close enough that they appeared to be talking. When Crystal saw him alone moments later, it struck her as strange. At the time, she did not know Amy was missing. She did not know she had witnessed something important. But looking back, that detail, the 10-minute gap, became one of the most haunting parts of her memory. Each of these women described the scene differently, in their own words, but the core details aligned. The time, the location, the pairing of Amy and Yellow, the early morning sunlight beginning to break over the shoreline, the moment before the ship would dock, and none of them had anything to gain by coming forward. In investigations like these, independent corroboration is critical. When multiple witnesses describe the same sequence of events, without knowing each other and without influence, the probability of accuracy increases dramatically. And here, the descriptions were too consistent to dismiss. With the timeline expanding past the balcony sighting at 5:30, the possibility of an accident shrank further. The idea that Amy fell overboard from the upper deck during sunrise would have required several improbable conditions. First, there were railings high enough to prevent a simple misstep. Second, the ship was moving slowly as it neared the harbor, not cutting through turbulent open ocean. Third, as local authorities emphasized later, anything falling into the water near the harbor would likely drift toward shore, not out to sea. The currents, the geography, the proximity to land all worked against the theory of a disappearance by water. And as they pointed out, even in tragic maritime accidents, something almost always surfaces. Clothing, a shoe, a piece of debris, something. But nothing was found. What did emerge instead were sightings, each one adding another thread to the theory that Amy had not fallen at all, that she had been taken. The Canadian man, David, described the woman he believed was Amy on the beach in Curaçao months later. He remembered how she looked around nervously, how she seemed on the verge of speaking to him before one of the men guiding her tightened his grip. It was a moment that did not feel like a tourist stroll or a couple's walk. It felt like surveillance, control, captivity. He remembered thinking the woman looked like someone silently begging for help through her eyes. And he remembered the tattoos, those identifying markers that could not be guessed or faked. He described them in detail. Tattoos were one of the strongest identifiers in missing persons cases because they are permanent, unique, and difficult to replicate convincingly. His accuracy made his account stand out in the investigation. The U.S. Navy petty officer, who saw the woman identifying herself as Amy Bradley in the Curaçao brothel, carried a guilt that gnawed at him for years. He had been in a location forbidden by Navy regulations. He feared repercussions, he feared for his job, he feared for his marriage, and so he said nothing. He walked away from a woman who whispered, "I'm Amy Bradley. I need help," thinking he was protecting himself. But when he later saw her face on the cover of a magazine, the realization hit him like a blow to the chest. The woman asking for help had been real. She had been Amy. And he had walked away. His testimony came too late. Long after the brothel had burned down. Long after any usable evidence had disappeared. Then there was the woman in Barbados, Judy, whose account became one of the most chilling. Bathrooms are places of vulnerability, where people remove the masks they wear in public. It was there, in the muffled, echoing chamber of a restroom, that Judy heard the urgency in the men's voices, the controlling tone, the instructions. She sensed danger immediately. Women often do. There is a visceral instinct that alerts them to the energy of a situation. She remembered her heart racing, she remembered her hands trembling, and when she stepped out and saw the young woman standing at the sink, her instincts sharpened further. The woman looked fragile, afraid, compliant. Judy tried to establish a connection when she asked her name and the woman answered softly, "Amy." It was like an invisible cord pulled tight. Judy knew something was wrong. She saw the fear. She saw the silent pleading. She saw the resignation. And she saw the men waiting outside. When she later saw Amy's case on television, the shock was overwhelming. Everything she remembered snapped into focus. She had seen her. She was certain of it. But perhaps the most haunting piece of evidence of all came in 2005, when the Bradley family was sent the photograph of the woman known as Jazz. The image was grainy, harsh, unsettling. The woman stared into the camera with eyes that seemed hollowed by time. Her hair was long, dark, styled differently than Amy's had been in 1998. Her makeup was heavy, mask-like. But her face, her features borne through unmistakably. The photograph hit her parents like a physical blow. They studied the details, the curvature of the eyebrows, the shape of the chin, the expression in the eyes, the alignment of the cheekbones. They recognized their daughter. They recognized the face they had raised, kissed goodnight, photographed, laughed with. The FBI's forensic analysis reinforced their belief. A perfect match, the expert had said. Perfect. But photographs can be deceptive. Lighting changes features, angles distort proportions, makeup alters appearances. So the debate raged, was this Amy or someone else? But the more pressing question was the one no one could ignore. If this was not Amy, then who was this woman? Why had no one come forward to identify her? What kind of life was she living? What horrors did that photograph represent? The discovery that the image may have been linked to the trafficking network operated by Alfred and Jennifer Cotton only deepened the nightmare. Their business model was explicit. They facilitated trips for men seeking sexual encounters with women in the Dominican Republic. They offered packages that included the services of multiple women, accommodations, transportation, and, through intermediaries like Paco, control over the women themselves. They used websites to advertise. They used American phone numbers. They used coded language. They used testimonials that spoke openly, sometimes shockingly, about the commodification of human beings. These testimonials were chilling not only for their content but for their tone. They portrayed trafficked women as if they were products, as if they were pets, as if their compliance was a performance, as if their suffering was entertainment. And in the midst of all that, the photograph of Jazz appeared, connecting the world of legal vacation cruises with the underground world of commercial sexual exploitation. Trafficking networks do not operate in isolation. They use legitimate businesses as cover. They infiltrate hotels, ports, transportation systems. They use employees who blend into the background: waiters, entertainers, taxi drivers, bar staff. They recruit vulnerable women. They abduct when necessary. They use charm, manipulation, drugs, force. And in tourist-heavy areas, places like the Caribbean, they have opportunities every single day. Amy had been watched on the ship. She had been photographed. She had been approached by multiple crew members. She had been observed alone at times. She had danced with a man who seemed to take particular interest in her. She had become part of the environment in ways she never intended. In that setting, with those circumstances, surrounded by thousands of strangers and dozens of staff with varying backgrounds and intentions, she became vulnerable without knowing it. Trafficking organizations often operate with frightening efficiency. They communicate quickly, they coordinate movements, they identify targets, they plan routes, they take advantage of confusion. And a cruise ship, with its constant movement, its transient population, its blurred lines between international waters and local jurisdictions, becomes fertile ground for exploitation. It was in this context that the digital footprints, the IP addresses, became even more significant. Someone had been observing the Bradley family's website. Someone had been looking at photographs of Amy, reading her parents' letters, checking her updates. Someone had been doing so consistently on dates that mattered. It could have been anyone, but the pattern felt personal. It felt like someone who knew Amy, or was Amy. Someone who felt a connection strong enough to return again and again. For her parents, that possibility was both painful and hopeful. The idea that Amy might be alive somewhere, trying to find a way back, trying to maintain some tether to the family she was ripped away from, was almost too much to bear. They wrestled with the hope that she was alive and the fear of what she might be enduring. But they never gave up searching. They never stopped believing that answers were possible. The hardest part of living with an unresolved disappearance is the tension between hope and grief. Hope fuels the search. Grief acknowledges the pain. But families of the missing cannot grieve the way others can. They cannot set down their burden. They cannot close their story. They cannot visit a grave or say goodbye. Their grief is suspended. Their hope is heavy. Every rumor, every sighting, every phone call becomes both a lifeline and a wound. As the years passed, the Bradley family continued pursuing leads with a kind of endurance few people possess. They consulted with experts. They hired investigators, real ones. They pressed authorities. They built websites. They kept Amy's face alive in the public eye. They fought fatigue. They fought doubt. They fought the unbearable weight of time. And time, in cases like these, is both an enemy and a witness. Time has a way of revealing cracks in stories that once seemed solid, and it has a way of sharpening the lines between truth and falsehood. As the years continued to move forward, what happened to Amy Lynn Bradley did not fade, it only deepened. Every new detail made the picture sharper, darker, more disturbing. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more it began to resemble a puzzle whose missing pieces had been scattered across countries, islands, memories, and digital traces. In the early years following Amy's disappearance, investigators worked with what little they had: the ship logs, the surveillance gaps, the witness statements, the interviews with crew members. But as time went on, more layers emerged, layers that pointed not toward an accident or a voluntary departure, but toward an orchestrated event, an act carried out by individuals who knew exactly what they were doing. The pieces began to point toward a coordinated removal of a young woman from a cruise ship in a way that left almost no trace. At the center of these possibilities stood one unavoidable truth. Amy was seen alive after the moment she was believed to have vanished. Witnesses who had nothing to gain, who did not know the Bradley family, who were not influenced by media coverage, and who had no reason to fabricate anything, all described seeing a young woman matching Amy's exact appearance. They remembered her tattoos, they remembered her hair, they remembered the way she moved, they remembered her eyes, and in the rare moments when these witnesses locked eyes with her, they recognized something universal: fear. People often underestimate how much can be conveyed silently through a glance. Fear has a way of showing itself in micro-expressions, in darting eyes, in tightened jawlines, in the stiffening of shoulders. It presents itself in a quiet plea that is instantly recognizable to those who witness it, even if they do not fully understand what they're seeing at the time. The Canadian man on the beach, the woman in the Barbados restroom, the Navy officer in the brothel, they all recognized something unsettling, something out of place, something wrong. Each account painted the same picture. A young woman held under the control of others, watched closely, monitored, cut off from freedom, desperately trying to communicate in the only ways she could. The possibility that Amy had been forcibly removed from the ship and transported into a trafficking network began to take shape not just because of sightings, but because of the emerging patterns of trafficking in the region. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Caribbean became increasingly connected to international trafficking routes. These routes involved ships, private boats, ports, hotels, and nightclubs that acted as meeting points for traffickers and buyers. Cruise ships were not immune. In fact, they were ideal for traffickers. Thousands of passengers, constant movement, a mixture of nationalities, gaps in jurisdiction, complex port laws, limited surveillance, crew members and service staff who rotated every few months, often hired from various regions without extensive background checks. The sheer size and anonymity of the operations created an environment where a single person could disappear quietly without immediate detection. In Amy's case, the ship was not searched immediately. Passengers were not held. The vessel was not locked down. The opportunity for a coordinated removal was undeniable. And even years later, the clues suggested that someone had taken advantage of this opportunity with chilling precision. The disappearance of Amy's photos from the cruise gallery is one of the most overlooked but disturbing elements of the case. Cruise photographers do not simply throw away prints. They are displayed for sale. They remain until the end of the day or longer. When Amy and her mother went to check the photos and found that all of Amy's prints were missing, the photographer was confused. He remembered printing them. He remembered placing them on the display wall. But they were gone. Someone took every photo that featured Amy. Not one, not two, all of them. This was not a random act. This was not a souvenir grab. This was deliberate. The idea that these photos could have been used to advertise Amy to traffickers or to potential buyers is horrific, but not impossible. In fact, in trafficking cases around the world, photographs are routinely used to showcase victims to buyers before they are moved. These images are circulated quietly, often digitally, sometimes through printed means, to select individuals within a network. The fact that Amy's photos disappeared before she vanished is one of the most chilling signs that her abduction may have been premeditated or opportunistic, but carried out with intent. The accounts from the Bradley family about the ship's staff's behavior in the final hours before Amy was declared missing added even more troubling layers to the story. When they approached the crew, requesting that the gangway be closed to prevent potential abductors from disembarking, they were told it would disturb the passengers. When they urged an announcement be made, they were told it was not possible. When they begged staff to search the ship, they were brushed off. These responses were not simply mistakes. They were catastrophic failures. In kidnapping cases, time is everything. The first hour is critical. The first minutes are crucial. The fact that hundreds of passengers and crew members were allowed to leave unsearched, unmonitored, and unrecorded destroyed countless potential leads. Once people stepped off the ship into Curaçao, the trail fractured into hundreds of possible locations. It was a moment that investigators could never reclaim. Theories circulated for years after about the level of involvement, if any, of individuals on the ship. Was Yellow acting alone? Was he part of something larger? Was he simply a man whose behavior happened to be misinterpreted? Or was he intentionally misleading investigators? His changing timeline and the contradictions between his statements and witness accounts made him a persistent focal point in the investigation. There was also the waiter, the one who invited Amy to go out in Aruba alone with him. His statements to the FBI included odd and unverified claims about conversations with the Bradley family. These fabrications only deepened suspicion. Questionable behavior from multiple crew members, combined with the missing photographs and the slow response of the ship's command, prompted many investigators to wonder whether there had been cooperation, incompetence, or something more coordinated happening behind the scenes. But the darkest piece of the puzzle did not arrive until years later, the photograph of the woman identified on the website as Jazz. When the email containing the image arrived, the Bradley family experienced something beyond shock. It was as though time itself froze. They stared at the image of the woman on the bed, the long dark hair, the heavy makeup, the slightly hollowed face, the wide-set eyes. The woman stared into the camera not with seduction but with emptiness. Not with confidence, but with resignation. Her face bore the strained expression of someone who had been forced to adapt to a life she never chose. Her parents immediately recognized her. Not because the woman looked like the Amy they knew, but because she looked like the Amy she might have become under unimaginable conditions. The heavy makeup could not conceal the structure of her face, the shape of her nose, the alignment of her lips, the curve of her jaw. Even in the distortion of the grainy image, her identity rang painfully clear. When the FBI's forensic facial analyst examined the photograph, the conclusion delivered was chilling. A perfect match. 2 words that shattered whatever hope her family had preserved that this might be a simple misunderstanding. Those 2 words became a haunting refrain that echoed through every subsequent part of the investigation. They were not casual words. Forensic analysts do not offer absolutes lightly. They examine measurements, proportions, distances between facial landmarks. They overlay images, adjust for angles, lighting, distortion. They compared dozens of data points. A perfect match is not just a statement, it is a scientific conclusion. But even if someone argued that the photograph was not Amy, the question persisted. Then who was she? And why did she look so eerily similar? Why had no woman come forward to claim that identity? Why did no family identify her? Why was her picture on a trafficking-related website? The silence was deafening. As the Bradley family dug deeper into the origins of the website, they uncovered more horrifying details: the involvement of the Cotton couple, their business dealings in the Dominican Republic, the descriptions of the women referred to as chicas, the operations of Paco the handler, the way testimonials casually discussed controlling women as if they were property. These testimonials were not vague hints, they were explicit. They described lineups of women, they described prices, they described management, they described a system built on exploitation. When the Cottons were arrested years later, the scale of their operation became clearer, and the horrifying possibility grew stronger, that Amy may have been absorbed into a similar network, one that moved women between islands and countries with relative ease. Trafficking networks often rely on isolation. They isolate victims physically, emotionally, and psychologically. They remove identification documents. They control movement. They change names. They impose routines. They instill fear. They create dependency. They threaten consequences if victims attempt escape. They move women frequently to prevent patterns. They manipulate, coerce, or drug victims into compliance. Over time, some victims become unrecognizable even to themselves. In that sense, the photograph of Jazz represented more than an image. It represented transformation. Transformation caused not by choice but by trauma. Transformation into someone Amy never intended to become. If the photograph was indeed Amy, it meant she had survived, but at an unbearable cost. If the photograph was not Amy, it meant someone else had suffered the same fate. Either way, the truth was devastating. The discovery of the IP addresses accessing the Bradley website added yet another chilling dimension. Someone had been visiting consistently from Curacao and sometimes Barbados, and not randomly. These visits occurred on meaningful dates: birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, dates connected to Amy's life and her family's memories. The visitors stayed on the site for long durations. They did not simply click in and leave. They read, they scrolled, they revisited pages, they looked at photographs. Whoever was accessing the site did so with intention. It is possible, of course, that the visitor was someone curious or someone researching the case. But the pattern, the timing, the consistency, the duration suggested something more personal. If it was Amy, it meant she was alive. It meant she was aware of the efforts to find her. It meant she was trying to hold on to something real in a world built on coercion and control. If it was not Amy, it meant someone connected to her disappearance was watching. Someone tracking the family's efforts, someone monitoring their knowledge. The thought that her captor or someone tied to her captors could be watching the family's website, checking in every year like a twisted ritual, was horrifying. But in cold cases, disturbing truths often sit right beside hopeful ones. The two coexist in an uneasy balance. The Bradley family learned to live in that balance. They learned to live in waiting, in uncertainty, in determination. They learned to navigate the strange world of advocacy, investigations, and media. They learned to recognize the difference between false hope and real leads. They learned to endure heartbreak after heartbreak, while still holding on to a small but persistent ember of hope that one day the truth would finally be known. Hope is a strange force. It refuses to die, even when evidence suggests it should. Hope carries families through the darkest moments, reminding them that absence is not proof of death, and doubt is not proof of despair. For the Bradleys, hope became both their anchor and their burden. It kept them searching. It kept them speaking. It kept them fighting. And what they fought most against was silence. Because silence is the trafficker's most powerful weapon. Silence protects networks. Silence erases victims. Silence buries evidence. Silence allows time to pass without accountability. But Amy's story refused to be silent. Her family refused to let it fade. They carried her story into newsrooms, courtrooms, television networks, internet forums, community meetings, and social media platforms. They made sure her name remained known. They made sure her face remained recognized. They made sure the world did not forget the young woman who boarded a cruise ship with her family and never came home. Her case is one of the most haunting, unresolved disappearances in modern times, not because it is unsolvable, but because it is solvable and yet remains unsolved. So many pieces exist, so many clues, so many witnesses, so many images, so many digital traces, so many unanswered questions. The truth is not absent, it is fragmented, scattered, waiting to be assembled. The passage of time has a cruel way of shaping a story like Amy's, not by resolving it but by stretching it into something long, painful, and unbearably incomplete. As the years pressed forward, the unanswered questions surrounding her disappearance only expanded, like a shadow growing longer with the setting sun. For the Bradleys, life became divided into two realities: the life they lived before the cruise, anchored by laughter and routine, and the life they inherited afterward, defined by grief, pursuit, and the relentless ache of the unknown. What made Amy's case so uniquely tormenting, especially for her family, was not simply that she vanished, it was how she vanished. It was the environment, the timing, the witnesses, the forensic indicators, the sightings, and the behavior of those who might have crossed her path. It was the undeniable feeling that something more than a tragic accident had occurred. Something deliberate, something organized, something that, if uncovered, might illuminate not only what happened to Amy, but the hidden networks that prey on the vulnerable across borders and oceans. The more investigators dissected the events of that morning, the more baffling the case became. The timeline was precise in some places and disturbingly vague in others. The certainty of Amy's movements in the hours leading up to her disappearance was strong photographs, videos, witness accounts, electronic door logs. But the moment after 5:30 in the morning, when her father last saw her legs stretched across the balcony chair, the details splintered into multiple paths. Some led nowhere, some led into darkness, some led into the testimonies of strangers who saw a woman they believed to be Amy long after she was presumed gone. But one of the most painful truths in the investigation was how preventable so many of the early mistakes were. The cruise line's decision not to initiate a full ship lockdown created a cascade of consequences that could never be reversed. The refusal to make an immediate announcement robbed the Bradley family of precious minutes that might have meant everything. The delayed cooperation with authorities created gaps in the timeline that would forever remain shadows. Had the ship been frozen in place even briefly, the web of possibilities might have been containable. But instead, it broke open, and Amy's trail scattered like sand in the wind. In the aftermath, experts from multiple fields began to weigh in: naval officers, legal specialists, trafficking investigators, behavioral psychologists, maritime security analysts. Many of them reached the same conclusion. The ship's response was catastrophically inadequate. Cruise ships operate under complex jurisdictions, but they also rely heavily on reputation. Incidents on board, especially disappearances, threaten their public image. Because of this, there is a long history of cruise lines downplaying or deflecting early reports of missing persons. For years, maritime advocacy groups have argued that cruise companies prioritize optics over immediate action. Amy's case became a glaring example of that systemic issue. The Bradley family later learned that, contrary to what they were told, the early search conducted on the ship was neither thorough nor immediate. In fact, several passengers reported that they were never asked to return to their cabins, never instructed to halt movement, never told that a woman was missing. Some even later claimed that they had interacted with crew members who appeared unaware that anything was wrong. These statements suggested that whatever Charlie drill the captain claimed to have ordered was either incomplete or falsely represented. This revelation only deepened the family's mistrust. But mistrust alone does not explain what happened next. For that, investigators turned their attention back to the sightings. The testimonies from Curaçao, Barbados, and the brothel report were frighteningly consistent. A young American woman, under watch, accompanied by controlling men, exhibiting fear but unable to express it openly. These descriptions were not fantastical. They were grounded, detailed, and emotional. Each witness expressed guilt, shock, or unease emotions that rarely accompany fabricated sightings. The Canadian man David recounted his memory with a clarity that could only come from trauma, not imagination. Judy, the witness from Barbados, described the bathroom encounter so vividly that it replayed in her mind for years. But the brothel encounter was the one that carried the deepest tragedy. The Navy petty officer heard her say her name, heard her ask for help, and still walked away. His regret, when he came forward years later, was profound and devastating. He could not undo the moment, but he could offer his testimony. For Amy's parents, hearing his account was like swallowing fire. The idea that Amy had reached out and been denied was a reality that tortured them. They tried to accept that he, too, had been young and afraid. But understanding does not erase pain. Knowing does not soothe the wound. As more information surfaced, investigators began mapping the geography of trafficking routes in the Caribbean routes that connected Curaçao, Aruba, the Dominican Republic, Barbados, and other islands in circular patterns. Women were often moved quickly, rapidly, and quietly, passed from one handler to another. Boats, private vessels, and smaller transportation hubs were frequently used. In these cases, passports or identification were irrelevant. Trafficked women were not moved through legal checkpoints, they were moved through shadows. Years after Amy's disappearance, retired federal agents and maritime security experts reviewed the few verifiable sightings and concluded something critical. If Amy had been taken, the type of network that would have orchestrated her movement was not small or amateur. It would have required connections within ports, transportation resources, and access to locations where victims could be hidden. Trafficking networks often operate under the guise of legitimate hospitality businesses, hotels, resorts, even bars, using them as front-facing shields to the public. This is where the Cotton Couple's operations became chillingly relevant. Their sex tourism enterprise was not a freelance scheme, it was a structured business model. They had a system, transportation, housing, handlers like Paco, and access to women who were constantly rotated, controlled, restricted, and surveilled. They had websites, advertising services, coded language, and pricing tiers. They took deposits, they managed bookings, they created an illusion of professionalism that masked a brutal underworld. When the photograph of Jazz surfaced, it was not only disturbing, it was a glimpse behind the curtain of how trafficking networks operate. Women are posed, photographed, cataloged, and listed, their images used as advertisements. They are stripped not just of freedom, but of identity. They are renamed, retitled, transformed into inventory. The Bradley family wondered whether the disappearance of Amy's cruise photos had been an early step in that process. The theory was horrific, but it made sense. It also explained the possible involvement of multiple individuals. Trafficking is rarely the work of one person. It requires coordination. It requires access. It requires role spotters, lurers, transporters, enforcers, handlers. On a ship carrying more than 2,000 passengers and hundreds of crew members, it is entirely possible that more than one person played a role in watching Amy, isolating her, leading her to a vulnerable location, and taking her off the ship before anyone realized she was gone. The testimonies around Yellow, his inconsistencies, his daughter's troubling comments, the mystery surrounding the collection of photographs she found, only deepened suspicion. While no one has proven he participated in trafficking, the patterns remained unsettling. His presence with Amy in the final hours, his contradictory statements, his connection to a staff position that allowed him freedom of movement, his recognition of Amy's habits like chain smoking, suggesting close observation. Yet, focusing solely on him risked ignoring the larger network that might have operated around him. And then, years after the disappearance, came the digital clue, the IP addresses accessing Amy's website. To someone unfamiliar with trafficking cases, this detail might seem minor, but to investigators, it was enormous. Traffickers do not usually monitor victims' families. They have little reason to, but victims often do. If Amy was alive, accessing the website could have been her only connection to the world she lost. Trafficking victims are sometimes allowed brief access to the internet under controlled circumstances, usually monitored, often restricted, but occasionally enough to search for something meaningful. The idea that Amy herself might have been quietly accessing her family's website, looking at her own missing posters, reading her parents' messages, and seeing the photos of her younger self was gut-wrenching. It was the kind of detail that could only exist in a nightmare. But there was another possibility, one that was equally disturbing. Someone else might have been looking, someone involved, someone checking whether her family still searched, someone curious about the investigation's progress, someone wanting to know if the world had forgotten. That possibility haunted her parents as well. There are moments in long-term missing person cases where silence becomes a kind of communication. A lack of evidence becomes evidence. A lack of contact becomes contact. Amy's family clung to the digital traces, analyzing them, hoping they signaled something hopeful. But hope, in these situations, becomes a double-edged sword, fueling the search but deepening the pain. As the investigation continued over the years, the Bradley family hired multiple investigators carefully, after being burned so brutally by the con artist Frank Jones. These investigators brought in specialists, including experts in international trafficking, digital forensics, maritime crime, and psychological profiling. Many reviewed the evidence and independently reached the same chilling conclusion. Amy's disappearance bore the hallmarks of trafficking. Some cases have ambiguity. Some cases have mixed signals. Some cases have multiple plausible theories. Amy's case did not. The indicators lined up too cleanly. Multiple witnesses saw her after she supposedly vanished. Tattoos were identified. Fear was visible. She was approached by suspicious crew members. Photos went missing. The ship did not perform proper security measures. A woman resembling her appeared years later in a trafficking-adjacent advertisement. Digital traces pointed to meaningful dates. A brothel worker heard her say her name. The pieces were there, just not assembled in time. The Bradleys fought tirelessly to push authorities to do more. They petitioned lawmakers, they spoke at hearings, they advocated for stricter cruise ship regulations, better reporting protocols, and improved international cooperation in maritime investigations. They shared their story publicly, even when doing so reopened old wounds, because they believed awareness could prevent others from experiencing the same tragedy. But what haunted them most was the absence of closure. Cases like Amy's exist in a space where hope and despair coexist in brutal equilibrium. There were days when the Bradleys believed wholeheartedly that Amy was alive. There were days when they felt crushed by the weight of every unanswered question, and there were days when all they could do was breathe. In many ways, the world failed Amy. It failed her on the cruise ship. It failed her in the early investigation. It failed her in the years that followed. But her family refused to let the world forget her. They refused to allow her story to fade into the background. They refused to stop searching. And the world, through documentaries, articles, interviews, and the advocacy of people moved by her story, continues to remember her too. Not as a mystery, but as a daughter, a sister, a person with a future stolen from her. As the years stretched further from that morning in 1998, the truth about what happened to Amy Lynn Bradley grew both clearer and more elusive at the same time. Clearer in the sense that the patterns were unmistakable patterns of behavior, patterns of sightings, patterns of systemic failure. Elusive in the sense that every new revelation opened a dozen more questions, each one slipping away just when it seemed within reach. It was like chasing a silhouette across the surface of water. Visible, undeniable, but impossible to grasp. The Bradley family had entered a world that no one ever imagines they will have to understand. A world of maritime law, international jurisdiction conflicts, trafficking routes, witness discrepancies, digital forensics, criminal psychology, and investigative politics. They became experts, not by choice but by necessity. When a loved one vanishes, families must learn to navigate systems that are not designed with their pain in mind. Parents become researchers, siblings become investigators, and grief becomes the engine that keeps them moving. One of the central issues they encountered was jurisdiction. Because the disappearance occurred on a ship operating under a foreign flag in international waters, but docked in Curaçao, inside the Kingdom of the Netherlands, with an American citizen missing, the legal tangle became dizzying. Each country could claim partial authority but also deflect responsibility. Maritime crimes fall under unique legal structures, and unless the ship itself performs an immediate, thorough response, evidence can be lost forever. Cruise ships function, in many ways, like floating cities. but they are cities with limited oversight, private security forces, and corporate interests that often supersede transparency. This is why the early hours mattered so deeply. If the ship had acted decisively, investigators could have questioned crew members immediately, verified alibis, searched cabins, secured hallways, collected surveillance footage before it was erased, and inspected passenger logs before they were altered by disembarkation. But none of that happened, and as time passed, the trail dispersed across continents. The Bradley family learned the hard way that cruise lines operate under a set of priorities that rarely align with the needs of victims' families. When someone disappears, the instinct of a corporation is often to minimize liability, not maximize truth. The Bradleys later discovered that Royal Caribbean representatives had begun constructing narratives about Amy's behavior before all witness statements had even been taken. Rumors were circulated, claims that she had been drinking heavily, that she had engaged in risky behavior, that she might have chosen to disembark voluntarily. These statements were not based on fact, they were based on assumption. And those assumptions shaped public perception in ways that took years to undo. But Amy didn't vanish because of recklessness. She vanished because someone acted with purpose. As the years went on, independent investigators interviewed dozens of passengers and crew members who had been on the Rhapsody of the Seas. Some provided fragments of information that, when pieced together, suggested something more calculated. Multiple people described seeing the same crew members hovering near Amy during the trip. Others noticed the way certain staff members watched her movements. Some noted that Yellow seemed unusually interested in her. While none of these observations individually proved anything, together they created a pattern of unwanted attention, an attention that Amy herself had expressed discomfort about. Traffickers do not always need to plan abductions in advance. Sometimes they identify opportunity. A young woman traveling in an unfamiliar environment, a ship with lax security, a family unaware of the dangers, a pattern of behavior that makes her easy to track, a moment when she is alone. Trafficking experts often say that abductors look for micro-opportunities, seconds, when vulnerability aligns with access. It doesn't take much. Just a moment. And Amy had moments, brief ones, when she was unaccompanied. By the time the ship docked in Curaçao, the opportunity window had passed. What remained were questions. And those questions only deepened when information emerged about the disappearance of her photographs from the cruise gallery. The idea that someone would remove all images of a single passenger without purchasing them is more than suspicious, it is tactical. Photographs are often the simplest tools traffickers use to display potential victims to buyers. Removing the gallery prints prevented other passengers from seeing them, possibly preventing recognition or unwanted attention. It also meant someone had access to them. Someone who was familiar with the gallery's setup, someone confident enough to take the photos without being seen, someone who might have used them later. Investigators attempted to trace the missing prints, but no record existed of who removed them. No one recalled seeing anyone take them. No surveillance cameras covered the area at that hour. The prints simply vanished just as Amy did. Over time, additional layers of the investigation revealed more disturbing things aboard the ship. When independent maritime crime specialists reviewed the case, they found it deeply troubling that the Rhapsody of the Seas crew performed what they considered an informationally selective search. Some cabins were checked. Many were not. Some crew areas were examined. Others, inexplicably, were not. There was little consistency in the protocol, and no verifiable documentation of what areas were actually searched. Passengers later described casual encounters with crew members during the supposed lockdown crew who appeared to be carrying out routine tasks, cleaning rooms, attending to passengers, and engaging in normal activities. Their behavior suggested that many were unaware that a young woman was missing. Such ignorance could only occur if the order to lock down the ship was never fully communicated. The loss of those critical early hours cast a long shadow over every sighting that followed. The sightings themselves, Curaçao, Barbados, the brothel, formed a pattern that investigators could not dismiss. They were not random. They clustered geographically along known trafficking routes. They described similar behavior: fear, control, confinement. They matched physical details, tattoos, height, build, hair, and they came from credible individuals who had little to gain from lying. One factor that strengthened the credibility of these sightings was the specificity of Amy's tattoos. Tattoos are among the strongest identifying features in missing persons cases. A trafficker can force someone to change their hair, their clothing, even their name, but tattoos are far more difficult to conceal. While they can be covered with makeup or clothing, they remain permanent. And Amy had several tattoos, each highly distinct. The Canadian tourist who saw her on the beach described the Tasmanian devil tattoo exactly. He described the gecko around her navel with perfect detail. He described the Japanese character on her ankle. These details were not widely publicized at the time. Forensics experts later noted that such accuracy made his sighting among the most compelling in the case. Judy, the woman who had the restroom encounter in Barbados, remembered the fear in Amy's eyes. What stood out most to her was not the appearance, but the emotion. Fear is one of the most powerful memory anchors humans experience. Traumatic moments become seared into memory, often more vividly than everyday interactions. Judy remembered the trembling in the woman's voice. She remembered the pause before she said her name. She remembered the way the men stood outside the restroom door, waiting. These details made the account disturbingly plausible. But perhaps the most haunting moment in all the sightings was the brothel account. The Navy petty officer's confession did not come lightly. He had carried guilt for years. He described the woman's urgency, her voice cracking as she said her name, the desperation in her tone, the pleading in her eyes. At the time, he was young, afraid of consequences, and confused about what he was witnessing. But his memory never faded. When he came forward, his regret was palpable. Stories like his are rare, and they often signal truth. The Bradley family and investigators connected that brothel to a larger network that moved women between islands like merchandise. It was the kind of place where women were not simply exploited, they were owned, where leaving was impossible, where silence was enforced violently, where asking for help could lead to punishment or death. That the brothel burned down after the sighting only fueled suspicion. Fires are common in these environments not because of accidents but because of destruction of evidence. A fire erases victims. It erases documents. It erases records. It erases traces of movement. Once destroyed, whatever happened inside can no longer be investigated. It was a devastating loss of what might have been one of the strongest links to Amy's fate. Years after these sightings, the Bradley family received the email with the photograph of the woman known as Jazz. It was a shock that felt like a physical blow. The woman in the photograph did not look like the 1998 version of Amy, but she looked like the version of Amy who could have survived years in captivity. Trauma changes people. Stress alters facial expressions, posture, muscle tension. Trafficking victims often develop the hollowed, vacant look seen in the photo. They hold their bodies differently. Their faces lose the softness of ordinary life. They carry their pain in their eyes. The photograph became one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in the entire case. The FBI's facial recognition analysis did not take feelings into account, it took measurements. It compared the distances between eyes, the slope of the nose, the contour of the jawline, the length of the philtrum, the proportion of the cheekbones. When forensic experts use the phrase, perfect match, it is not conjecture, it is science. This photograph also revealed something else. The network that posted it was connected to a known sex tourism ring. The Cotton's business model was cold, calculated, and deeply illegal. Their website displayed women-like products. The testimonies of their clients, posted online as reviews, described experiences that were coercive, degrading, and violent. Many of the women they exploited were moved frequently. Some came from other islands. Some came from South America. Some came from places where disappearances were rarely investigated. In such networks, new victims are not recruited randomly. They are targeted, selected, tracked, then transported. The idea that a young American woman could be taken into such a network was horrifying but not impossible. In fact, it was entirely consistent with patterns seen in other countries. Investigators studying trafficking routes in the 2000s noted that traffickers often valued American women highly specifically because they were less likely to fight back once isolated and more likely to draw high prices from clients who viewed them as exotic or rare. It was a grim reality that made Amy's case even more chilling. Her disappearance had all the hallmarks of a targeted abduction. The missing photos, the suspicious crew behavior, the sightings, the photograph, the digital traces, the brothel confession, and the repeated visits to her family's website. The IP logs revealed something deeply personal. Someone in Curaçao, and occasionally in Barbados, accessed the Bradley website on emotionally significant dates. These were not random visits. They were long, sustained sessions. Whoever was accessing the site was reading deeply, scrolling through updates, looking at family photos, returning year after year. Some believed this was Amy herself, finding the only sliver of connection she had left to the world she had been torn away from. Others believed it was someone connected to her captors, someone checking to see if the family knew too much. Both possibilities were unbearable, but both suggested that Amy's case was far from cold. Despite all the years that passed, her story continued to surface, mentioned in documentaries, discussed on forums, analyzed in true crime communities, revisited by journalists. And each time the story resurfaced, more people learned her name. More people came forward with memories. More people realized they might have seen something years earlier that suddenly felt meaningful. For the Bradleys, the hardest part of the journey was not knowing, not having a body, not having proof, not having certainty. Living in the liminal space between hope and grief is a torment unlike anything else. It is waking each day, unsure whether to mourn or search, unsure whether to move forward or hold on. Families of the missing often describe this state as being trapped outside of time, always waiting, always suspended between two realities. But the Bradleys refused to surrender to despair. They became advocates for cruise safety reform. They pushed for the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act, which finally passed in 2010, largely because of families like theirs who demanded better oversight, stricter protocols, and mandatory reporting for incidents on board ships. Their courage and persistence saved lives even though they still waited for answers about their own daughter. As Part 4 approached its final arc, the understanding of Amy's disappearance took on a form that was both heartbreaking and resolute. Her story was not just a missing persons case. It was a warning about vulnerabilities in tourism industries. It was a spotlight on trafficking networks that thrive in the shadows. It was a testament to the failures of corporate responsibility, and it was a tragic reminder that even a young woman on vacation with her family can be targeted, watched, and taken without a trace. The Bradleys have always believed that someone, somewhere, knows what happened to their daughter, and they are right. Trafficking networks are built on secrecy, but they are not perfect. Someone saw something. Someone heard something. Someone interacted with someone involved. Someone remembers something that seemed irrelevant at the time. Someone knows the truth. And the truth, no matter how deeply buried, leaves fingerprints. In the quiet moments, the ones that come late at night, when the noise of the world dies down and the mind has room to wander, those who followed Amy's case often found themselves turning over the same questions that have haunted her family for more than 2 decades. How does someone vanish from a crowded ship? How does a young woman, surrounded by her parents and brother, disappear without a single scream being heard, without surveillance capturing her final movements, without a shred of physical evidence left behind? How does a life with so much vibrancy, so much promise, so much love intertwined around it get stolen so quietly that the world keeps spinning without noticing? The painful answer sits in the shadows, because that's where the people who took Amy operate. The most tragic part of Amy's story is that her disappearance was not the result of a single moment, but the result of many moments, each one building upon the last. The subtle ways crew members approached her, the lingering glances, the invitation from the waiter to go off the ship in Aruba alone, the band member who seemed to watch her closely, the missing photographs, the inadequate search, the early refusal to signal an emergency, the decision to allow passengers and crew to disembark freely. Each one of these choices, small and seemingly disconnected, formed a chain that led to the moment Amy was taken. But when building a case that spans decades, investigators know that the most important patterns aren't always found in the biggest moments. They're found in the consistencies that repeat themselves across testimonies, sightings, digital traces, and timelines. The consistency in Amy's case has always pointed toward trafficking. Every credible witness account described control, surveillance, fear. A young woman moved between islands, watched closely, deterred from speaking, accompanied by men who behaved like handlers, not companions. Witnesses didn't describe a woman partying, exploring, or traveling freely. They described a woman who seemed trapped. The Canadian man who saw her on the Curacao beach remembered her eyes, and nothing haunted him more. He said they carried a kind of pain he had never seen in another human being, a pain so deep that it unsettled him for years afterward. He didn't know who she was, not then, but when he saw her tattoo descriptions on the news, something inside him shattered. He knew he had seen her. He knew he had looked directly into the eyes of a woman who needed help but could not ask for it. And he had walked away because he didn't understand what he was seeing. Judy, who met her in the Barbados restroom, described the kind of fear that lives behind a person's ribs. The kind that slips out only when someone thinks they might be safe for a moment. When the woman who called herself Amy said her name, Judy felt the world tilt. It was only years later, when she saw Amy's photograph on television, that the pieces locked into place so violently she could hardly breathe. For 2 years, she carried the guilt of leaving that restroom and not doing more. But fear works on ordinary people the same way it works on victims. It freezes them. It paralyzes them. It confuses their instincts at the exact moment clarity is needed. And then there was the brothel account. The one that haunted the Navy petty officer long after he returned home. He didn't forget the voice. He didn't forget the desperation. He didn't forget the quiet urgency with which she said her name. "I'm Amy Bradley. Please help me." Those words, spoken in a low, trembling breath, replayed in his head like a curse. When he saw her photo on a magazine years later, his stomach dropped. The guilt hit him so forcefully that he eventually confessed everything he had seen and heard. He spoke not as a soldier but as a man who realized he had failed someone who needed him. These sightings formed a chilling triangle. Curaçao, Barbados, and the brothel, all linked by the same pattern of movement. And those islands, investigators later confirmed, were commonly connected through trafficking routes during the late 90s and early 2000s. These routes moved women from one island to another to limit attachment, reduce recognition, and prevent escape. Women were rotated constantly. Amy may have been one of them. One of the darkest truths about trafficking is that it often unfolds in plain sight. Victims might walk on beaches. They might sit in restaurants. They might appear in nightclubs. They might be escorted through public places by people who look like boyfriends, husbands, or friends. To the untrained eye, nothing seems unusual. To those who know the signs, everything does. That was the reality in Amy's case. The danger was always visible. But no one recognized it soon enough. Years after Amy disappeared, when the Bradley family received the photo of Jazz, it felt like the world stopped moving. The woman in the photograph looked exhausted, hardened, changed. But change is not evidence of loss. Captivity reshapes people. Trauma remolds their faces, their bodies, their expressions. The lines in their skin deepen, not from age, but from fear. Their posture collapses under the weight of control. The spark in their eyes dims. When investigators analyzed the photo, they didn't look at her expression. They looked at mathematics, facial proportions, ratios, symmetry, structural alignment. The measurements matched. The analyst's conclusion, perfect match, became one of the most devastating sentences ever uttered in the case. If the woman in the photograph was Amy, it meant she lived for years after her disappearance. It meant she existed in a world where she had no freedom. It meant she thought about her family. It meant she missed them. It meant she remembered her life before the ship. It meant she suffered. If the woman in the photograph was not Amy, it meant someone else had lived that nightmare. Someone whose identity remains unknown. Someone whose life was stolen. Someone whose suffering was photographed and displayed for profit. Either truth is unbearable. The discovery of the IP addresses accessing the Bradley family's website created another layer of haunting possibility, one that breathed new life into the hope that Amy might still be alive somewhere. The idea that someone in Curaçao or Barbados repeatedly visited her website on significant dates, her birthday, the anniversary of her disappearance, holidays, was not a coincidence. Someone was watching. Someone was remembering. Someone cared. If it was Amy, those visits were cries for connection. Silent signals through a digital window she could access briefly, secretly, perhaps in rare moments when she was allowed near a computer. Victims in captivity sometimes cling to tiny scraps of autonomy, moments when they can search their own names, look at old photos, find reminders of who they once were. If those IP visits were her, they were not random, they were survival. If it was not Amy, the implication was even darker. Someone connected to the trafficking operation might have been checking to see whether the Bradleys had learned anything new, whether investigators were close, whether the world had stopped looking. Either possibility is chilling. With every passing year, the Bradleys were forced to navigate the painful terrain of hope and grief. Their home became a place filled with photographs, case files, voicemails from investigators, letters from strangers, news clippings, and memories that never stopped aching. Their son, Brad, who had been the last family member to see Amy alive, carried the weight of that moment for the rest of his life. The moment he saw her sleeping on the balcony chair, believing she was safe, not knowing it would be the last time he ever saw his sister. He carried the guilt of not checking earlier, the guilt of not hearing something, the guilt of not waking her. None of that guilt was justified, but grief rarely listens to reason. It clings to the heart and refuses to let go. For Amy's parents, every lead became a lifeline. Every rumor became a new thread. Every email, every sighting, every whisper became something to examine. They lived in a state where hope hurt and despair hurt even more. They became the voice for their daughter when the world grew quiet. They pushed for reforms that reshaped cruise safety laws. They refused to allow Amy's name to sink into silence. What makes Amy's story so profoundly tragic is not just that she disappeared, it is that she may have lived for years afterward, waiting for someone to recognize her, waiting for an opening to escape, waiting for her family to find her. Her disappearance is not a story frozen on the 24th of March 1998. It is a story that echoed through Curacao beaches, Barbados restrooms, brothel hallways, digital traces, and photographs on trafficking websites. It is a story that travels across borders, across islands, across decades. It is a story that refuses to rest, and the truth is that someone, somewhere, knows exactly what happened. Whether it was a crew member, a trafficker, a handler, a client, or someone who walked past her without realizing who she was, someone holds a piece of the truth. That truth has survived, buried, but unbroken, waiting. And the Bradley family continues to live with the hope that one day it will reach the surface. In the years that followed Amy Lynn Bradley's disappearance, time did not behave normally for the Bradley family. Days stretched long and heavy, filled with the kind of waiting that exhausts the spirit. But nights were even longer. Nights were when the mind replayed moments, imagined possibilities, and wandered into the shadows of what-ifs that no parent should ever have to confront. For Ron, Iva, and Brad, those early years were a cycle of searching, pleading, fighting, and hoping, because hope, no matter how painful, was still better than silence. But as time moved on, something unexpected happened. Amy's case did not fade. It didn't disappear into obscurity the way so many missing person cases do. Instead, it grew. It expanded through conversations, television features, international reporting, advocate groups, criminology circles, and survivor support networks. Her name surfaced again and again, not because the world had answers, but because the world sensed that her story wasn't finished. Something about Amy's disappearance tugged at people. It felt incomplete, unresolved, and disturbingly plausible in ways that mirrored thousands of other cases across the globe. The reason Amy's case resonated so deeply was because her disappearance represented something larger, something systemic, something organized, something terrifyingly real. When she vanished, she wasn't just a young woman on a vacation. She became part of a conversation the world had avoided for too long. The conversation about what truly happens when someone is targeted by a trafficking network that knows exactly how to operate in the shadows. As the months turned into years, the Bradleys realized they had to do more than search for Amy. They had to educate others. They had to warn families. They had to shine a light on an industry that often goes overlooked because it operates on the fringes of society, blending into nightlife, tourism, transient travel, and entertainment. Their advocacy became not only a mission for Amy, but a mission for the countless unnamed individuals whose stories never reach the headlines. For many families who lose someone under mysterious circumstances, the struggle lies in convincing the world that the person did not vanish willingly, did not run away, did not choose to disappear. In Amy's case, this problem was amplified by the setting an international cruise ship, full of strangers, transient workers, and multinational jurisdictions. It was a world where jurisdiction blurred, responsibility shifted, and accountability dissolved into corporate policy statements. But the Bradleys remained relentless. They attended hearings, they spoke at conferences, they sat across from investigators with binders full of notes. They met journalists in living rooms, offices, cafes, and conference rooms. They answered every message from every person who claimed to know something. They funded their own searches. They documented every lead. They traveled across countries, knocking on doors, meeting local authorities, hiring consultants, and retracing steps. What stands out most is that the Bradleys did not operate like a family that had lost their daughter. They operated like a family that believed she was still out there. Because somewhere deep in their core, they felt Amy was still alive. And the evidence supported that belief. The sightings, the descriptions, the consistency, the photograph labeled Jazz, the voice from the brothel, the digital footprints, the testimonies of strangers who had no motive to lie. Yet even with these clues, the Bradleys often found themselves up against barriers that would test the strongest hearts. International investigations are rarely straightforward. Sovereign borders, differing laws, complicated extradition processes, local jurisdiction conflicts, language barriers, cultural differences, and inconsistent cooperation all created obstacles. When you are dealing with a crime that may involve smuggling, organized individuals, and money, lots of money, the challenges multiply. The Bradleys lived with frustration that is difficult to put into words. At times, they wondered why their daughter's case wasn't taken more seriously in the early stages. Why the ship wasn't locked down. Why the captain refused to make a public announcement. why there was no immediate search, why it took almost 2 days for federal agents to board the ship, why crucial evidence was not preserved, why witnesses were allowed to leave the ship, why potential suspects were free to walk away. But they also knew dwelling on the past wouldn't find Amy, so they chose action over resentment. One of the most significant developments in the case came from the renewed global attention it received in the years following the documentary releases and media appearances. Each time Amy's story appeared on television or online, more people learned her face. More people heard about the tattoos. More people learned about the sightings. More people became aware of the signs of trafficking. And sometimes, awareness is all it takes to keep hope alive. When people heard the details of her tattoos, the baby Tasmanian devil spinning a basketball, the gecko around her navel, the Japanese and Chinese characters on her lower back and ankle, they remembered them. Tattoo artists in the Caribbean kept a watchful eye. Tourists recognized them from news features. Former military personnel, humanitarian workers, and volunteer groups in the region began to quietly monitor for women who might match her description. Every once in a while, a tip would surface. Sometimes vague, sometimes detailed, sometimes promising, sometimes impossible to verify, but each one mattered. Trafficking networks often rely on high turnover, anonymity, and constant movement to prevent identification. Victims are moved frequently, sometimes weekly, sometimes nightly, depending on demand. They're taken to hotels, apartments, back rooms of bars, private villas, and rural areas where tourism is a veneer used to mask exploitation. Islands like Curacao, Dominican Republic, Barbados, and Aruba are connected through routes that boats travel casually: charters, fishing boats, small ferries, private yachts. Amy could have been moved through any of these channels. One of the lesser-known realities of trafficking is that sometimes victims are used to lure or recruit others. They are forced to appear compliant. They are instructed to smile. They are threatened to behave willingly. They may look like participants, but they are not. This manipulation creates confusion for outsiders and protection for traffickers. Survivors who escape later tell hauntingly similar stories, stories of being watched constantly, never being left alone, fearing punishment, fearing for their families, and clinging to any moment of autonomy to preserve their identities. They describe glancing at strangers with pleading eyes, hoping someone will notice, hoping someone will help. Every credible witness in Amy's case described that same look. One of the most powerful details came from Judy, the woman from Barbados. When she described Amy's expression, she struggled to find the right words. It wasn't panic, it wasn't hysteria, it was something quieter, something deeper. Something that belonged to a person who had been living in fear for a long time. A person who had learned the consequences of speaking too loud. A person who recognized danger even in a whisper. And the men who stood outside the restroom were not acting like friends or companions. They stood like watchers. For the Bradleys, these patterns became impossible to ignore. Something else about Amy's case stood out: her strong will, her athleticism, her intelligence, her independence, her ability to resist manipulation, her physical strength. These were not qualities of someone who gave up easily. They were qualities of someone who survived. And that was one of the things that gave her family hope. As the years went by, they wondered whether Amy might be waiting for an opportunity, waiting for the right moment, waiting for a safe escape route, waiting for someone to recognize her, waiting for authorities to take action in the right place at the right time. But they also had to confront a heartbreaking truth. Without physical evidence, without a verified location, without cooperation from those who might hold the answers, the case could not move forward in the way they wished. That didn't mean the case was cold. It meant the case was complicated. And sometimes, complicated cases reawaken years later, not because new evidence surfaces, but because new awareness does. That is what began happening as documentaries, podcasts, and investigative programs revisited Amy's story. Viewers around the world rediscovered the details. They examined the timelines. They studied the photographs. They compared the sightings. They talked about the missing gallery photos. They analyzed the trajectory of the ship. They looked into the involvement of specific crew members. They connected the timing of sightings across multiple islands. They traced the history of trafficking-related businesses that operated in the region during the late 90s and early 2000s. And slowly, the case gained renewed momentum. The Bradley family never stopped cooperating with authorities. They remained open to reinvestigation, new leads, and modern tools like digital mapping, analytics, international coordination, and advanced facial recognition capabilities. There were moments when technological improvements nearly transformed the direction of the search. But technology can only do so much without a starting point. That is why the photograph labeled Jazz continues to be one of the most important pieces of potential evidence in Amy's case. Not because it proves definitively what happened, but because it aligns with every credible detail gathered over the years: the tattoos, the locations, the timeline, the demographic of victims targeted by trafficking rings at that time, the operational style of the groups identified, the geography of the sightings, the faces of the individuals involved in similar cases. If the woman was Amy, it meant her story continued long after the ship reached Curaçao. If the woman was not Amy, it meant someone else endured that reality. And if someone else endured that reality, it meant that the operations linked to the website were real, active, and capable of moving victims across islands. In either scenario, the truth pointed toward trafficking. Over time, the Bradleys' advocacy had an impact far beyond their own case. They helped raise awareness about cruise ship safety, missing person reporting, investigative urgency, crew vetting practices, and victim support resources. Their voices led to improvements in international protocols that ensure missing person cases at sea are handled with greater seriousness and transparency. Their persistence inspired legal changes, operational changes, and public awareness that continues to support families facing similar tragedies. Through all of this, the Bradleys maintained something extraordinary: compassion. Compassion for survivors they met along the way. Compassion for families who reached out to them. Compassion for strangers who wrote letters. Compassion for individuals who shared stories of their own losses. Their strength became a source of comfort for others, even while they carried their own heartbreak. In recent years, online communities, digital investigators, and viewers across platforms have reignited the conversation around Amy's case. With renewed visibility came renewed leads. Some were hopeful, some were misleading, some were worth forwarding to authorities, some were ruled out, but each one proved that people had not forgotten Amy. One of the most powerful things about the modern era is that a single story can travel farther than ever before. One documentary can be watched in dozens of countries. One video clip can be shared millions of times. One photograph can reach the right person at the right moment. One witness can recognize a detail they overlooked years earlier. One survivor can come forward with information. Awareness is often the spark that brings new truth to the surface. And Amy's story reached a new generation: people who were not alive in the 90s, people who grew up online, people who understand trafficking dynamics, people who recognize the signs that earlier decades missed. For these viewers, Amy wasn't just a missing person. They saw her as a representation of every individual who has vanished without explanation, every victim whose story remains unfinished, every family waiting for answers. That is why her case remains so emotionally powerful. The Bradleys continue to hope. Even now, decades later, they do not speak about Amy in the past tense. They speak as if she is still here, somewhere, waiting. They remember her laugh. They remember her bright smile. They remember her athletic talent, her love for basketball, her bulldog she never got to bring home, her excitement about her new job. They remember the last night they danced with her on the ship. They remember her independence. They remember how she loved music. They remember how she avoided the railings because she felt uneasy around the edges of the ship. All of these memories form the anchor that keeps them steady through the uncertainty. They still believe in the possibility of answers. And that belief matters. Because sometimes justice takes decades. Sometimes it takes new witnesses. Sometimes it takes new technology. Sometimes it takes global attention. Sometimes it takes one person who has been silent for years to finally speak. Sometimes survivors escape and bring truth with them. Sometimes a photograph resurfaces. Sometimes a pattern clicks into place. Sometimes someone who once believed they were powerless suddenly realizes they hold a crucial piece of information. The story is not over. The final message of Amy Lynn Bradley's case is not one of despair, it is one of persistence. The persistence of a family, the persistence of truth, the persistence of a world that refuses to let her name fade. For every viewer who hears her story, for every person who shares her photograph, for every traveler who becomes more aware of their surroundings, for every parent who learns to recognize warning signs, for every survivor who finds strength to speak, Amy's legacy lives on. Dark Case Desk is committed to keeping that story alive, to telling it with care, to honoring her family's strength, to shining a light into places where answers still hide. If Amy is out there, if she is still moving through the world in ways we cannot see, the story's visibility increases the chances that someone, somewhere, will recognize her. And if there are people who know what happened, who have held on to truth for years, perhaps this renewed attention will make silence harder to maintain. Until answers come, her story remains a call for awareness, vigilance, empathy, and accountability. Amy Lynn Bradley was 23 years old when she boarded that ship with a bright future ahead of her. She deserves closure. She deserves justice. She deserves peace, and her family deserves to know what happened. If you have listened to her story today, if you have stayed with us through the details, the theories, the testimonies, and the timelines, then you are part of keeping her memory alive. Please take a moment to like this video, comment your thoughts, and hit the subscribe button so more people can learn about cases like Amy's and help keep awareness strong. When names stay alive, answers sometimes follow. This is Dark Case Desk, and as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for caring. Thank you for listening. Until the next episode, stay safe, stay aware, and take care of one another.